Hi, I'm Anna Dietrich. I'm the co-executive director at the Community Air Mobility Initiative, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to supporting state and local decision makers with integrating the third dimension into their current transportation landscapes. So I'm just going to go through a few of the key considerations that we see for that process, as well as provide a little bit of a status of where we see things sitting in that arena. So what is advanced air mobility? Advanced air mobility, urban air mobility, these terms get tossed around a lot. And I think it's just helpful to kind of ground the conversation in what do we mean by these terms. So advanced air mobility is something that NASA has recently started using. Urban air mobility would be a subset of advanced air mobility, as would regional air mobility. Those are both acronyms that get used quite frequently. And in some ways, this is a brand new thing. We're talking about new vehicles, new ConOps, using aviation in new ways, but in other ways, this is really something that we've been doing for quite a long time. So, we've got helicopters that fly today, we've got general aviation, and we have microhaul airline flights that fly on with smaller planes on shorter routes already. So this is an amalgamation of existing and new concepts. I think it's important to realize that it's also a lot bigger than just the on-demand air taxi that gets a lot of attention when you talk about this space. So in terms of zones of operation, it's not just downtown. It includes the suburbs, it includes ed city connectivity, it includes rural access, and it includes access to hub commercial airports as well. Types of operation, a lot of the things we're currently doing today, airline microhaul, air metro is a new one that would be sort of operating it on more of a bus schedule. On-demand air taxi, of course, airport shuttles, maybe potentially even landing airside at a commercial hub airport, and emergency services, which is very promising as we look at early use cases and ways of building public acceptance for these aircraft. Really the key value proposition that we see for UAM isn't necessarily beating congestion, but it's allowing you to do dramatically more with the time that people allot for travel in a given day. So really since the beginning of people traveling, we've been giving about the same amount of time to that activity in our days. So we travel for about an hour. Kind of regardless of how we're traveling. So when you were walking, that didn't get you very far. Horse and buggy increased your range. Early model cars increased your range even further. Modern automobile gives you about 70 miles in that time. And we're looking at eVTOL aircraft expanding that range to over 150 miles. So really, you're just increasing your personal reach with the amount of time that you're willing to travel. And that's why we think this is particularly promising. So where are we as an industry? So I mean, by the time you're watching this, this may have changed again, but I think broadly we are seeing a lot of maturation in the vehicle technical development. We have full-size flying aircraft. We have multiple flight tests happening on a regular basis across multiple different companies and vehicle designs. There's progress being made in certifying those aircraft. The CAAs are coming up with what their approaches to those aircraft are going to be. And we have a standards library and a means of compliance library that's being built out to support those certification efforts. So we're making real progress there. There's already cargo operations happening with unmanned aircraft that in many ways can serve as a conceptual template for some of the later stage UAM operations. We've seen some really serious ConOps being put forward by FAA and NASA. They may need work, but they're a fantastic place to start. And we're also seeing a few locations that are really primed for early operations in the next 3 to 5 years. So cities that are really ready to enter that sort of crawl phase of deployment. What do we still need? So focusing just on Cami's area of specific interest, not on vehicle design or certification, I think there's sort of 4 areas that really need a lot of attention to make this a reality. State and local policy, infrastructure readiness, public acceptance, and transportation integration all really need to be brought up to a level of maturity that we aren't at yet for this to be successfully rolled out in the near term. You can kind of see on the slide here what the different pieces of all of those things are. We're going to pick and choose and talk about some of those in more depth going forward here. But we need policy that's consistent across multiple jurisdictions while simultaneously being appropriately customized for a given jurisdiction. We need to support state and local decision makers as they craft that policy. What are all of these acronyms? What do all of the words mean? What are the technical considerations that they need to keep in mind? All of those questions need answers, and we need to make sure that the right people are asking the right questions. Infrastructure readiness is an interesting one. We already have a lot of infrastructure in aviation, especially GA in the United States, but it needs to be repurposed. It needs to be rethought about how we're using it to be able to use it for some of these operations. And then we need to make sure that we have the electrical grid and generation capacity to support the electrification, not just of aviation, but of the ground transportation fleet as well. And it requires some significant investment to do that. Public acceptance is obviously essential to a new industry taking off. We need to build trust. There needs to be an appropriate level of education and communication so that people know what these things are and what they can do with them. The benefit has to be really clear for society and for the community at large. And that's where the early emergency services use cases can be very valuable, providing an opportunity to really demonstrate how these aircraft can serve members of their communities. And think about how the reaction differs between seeing a medevac helicopter fly over versus seeing a commuter or recreational helicopter fly over, right? Transportation integration is another area that is of particular interest to Cami. So connecting these aircraft to existing transit options. This is a very different way of thinking about aviation. Traditionally, you kind of go to the airport, you go through the gate, you're now in a secure environment, you go through security at a commercial airport, and it's really something apart from the rest of how you travel on a daily basis. So we're going to have to more closely connect this to the ways that we currently travel. And we're going to have to be ready for those ways to shift. So the data that we have currently on how people travel and when they travel and where they go, that's all likely to change if you give them a completely new way of traveling. So we need to be, thinking on our toes for that. And it's a personal passion of mine that we keep equity in mind as we make these plans. It's very easy to sort of fall into old patterns or to just simply not think about it. But I think we have an opportunity to craft a world the way it will work best for the most people in our communities. So I don't have a magic bullet solution to how to do that in these conversations, but I think it's important that it be part of the conversation. Oops. So, and who's having these conversations? So the federal level, and again, we're primarily talking about the US for a lot of these certification activities, so obviously not exclusively. Federal level has been getting a lot of attention with both certification and sort of broader high-level policy questions. The state and local level really has not been getting that focus. So Cami really is targeted at that state and local level to support the people that actually have to make the hard decisions about when and where and how these aircraft can land in their communities. Infrastructure considerations, you'll see there's a lot of questions on this page and not a lot of answers. Some of these will be very specific to individual communities. Some of them will have sort of a toolkit or a common methodology that can be used to answer them. But we really need to be thinking in terms of, what is the environment that we're trying to serve? Are we building or repurposing building new infrastructure, repurposing old infrastructure? How do we do that in terms of land use? That's one area of policy that local jurisdictions have a lot of control over is land use. So how can we use that as a tool in this situation? And then, as we go through this list, we want to make sure that we're connecting to and prioritizing transportation solutions that are environmentally friendly and good for the community at large, and connecting things, like I said, as closely as we can. Public acceptance, and changing gears a little bit, working through that list of things that need attention. The number one piece of public acceptance is trust. Without that, we're not going to see this widely adopted. Part of that is the vehicle safety, and that feels like it's fairly well in hand in terms of the certification activities that the CAAs do. So when we talk to individual jurisdictions, safety actually isn't high on their list of priorities of things that they want us to talk to them about, not because they don't think it's important, it's very important, but because they feel that it's well in hand already with FAA and EASA and the CAAs that are looking at vehicle safety and certification. Public benefit, integration with existing transportation and the community and the electric grid and all of those things that we touched on also have to be really foundational to public acceptance. And then limited adverse impacts is an interesting one because these things are going to have some sort of a negative impact. It's unavoidable to operate kind of in the world around you and not have people notice that you're operating there. So those are going to be some level of noise. You're going to be able to see them, whether the power, however the power is being generated. there's a potential for some environmental impact there. And there's privacy concerns. People are concerned about things flying over their neighborhoods and their houses. So instead of trying to pretend that these things don't exist, that there aren't these potential downsides to this new industry, we were really taking the approach that we need to acknowledge them and then be proactive in mitigating them and coming up with integrated solutions that, put these things in context of the balance against the public benefit. So you're getting enough out of these technologies that it's worth the adverse impacts that you might have to incur. But also, if you're planning ahead and doing it well, you can minimize them. So those are sort of the four sort of foundational pieces that we see for public acceptance. I'm going to pick at a couple of these again in more depth, kind of rapid fire here in the time frame, but some of the potential public benefits may really be surprising. So it's not just about travel, though certainly that's part of it. And it's not really just about congestion. I think having additional transportation options gives you additional levers to turn, dials to turn, different demand management options, I think is the technical phrase there, but it really is more about giving you additional ways of moving around in your community, not just about taking cars off the road. Once you get into a downtown area, you don't necessarily need, you don't have to park your car if you flew in, things like that. And then I particularly like the workforce aspects of this. We have a resource recently posted to the Cami website that talks about the economic impact of building a vertiport in a community. And it's not trivial. There's actually some significant potential for workforce development and economic benefit around these vertiport locations. The public good aspects of disaster response, emergency services, and then urgency trip pairing. This last one here, I'll just touch on that real quick. This is a really interesting one from the perspective of encouraging people to use mass transit. So maybe you aren't taking the commuter rail into work because you're concerned about not being able to get home if you get a call from the nurse at your child's school that you need to come pick them up, that they have a fever or something like that. So with a pairing model, you can take the commuter rail on most days. And then if you have that urgent situation come up, there's an arrangement where you can then take a flight to meet that need. So some creative ways of integrating what we already have with where we're going. That integration, like I keep coming back to this theme of integration. This is something that's really dramatically different as we think about advanced air mobility and urban air mobility from how we've traditionally thought of aviation. So we're not going to the other side of the fence. We're trying to connect this directly into our cities, directly into our current transportation landscapes. And to do that well, we need to be mitigating this whole laundry list of potential negatives, but also really encouraging the positive potential of these aircraft and their use in our communities. We need to consider all the existing transportation options. We need to consider accessibility. We need to consider social equity, secondary impacts, both positive and potentially negative. And the idea of using zoning as one of these areas of policy that cities and local decision makers have some influence over is something that I think is empowering to those decision makers and can be done well, can be done in a way that supports safe operations as well as the maximum benefit for everybody with these vehicles. So I'll just wrap up here with a note about what Cami is trying to do within all of this. So really just sort of a scatter shot of different things that we think about on a daily basis here, but we do have a number of resources available currently online to allow a deeper dive into these different questions. Hopefully this got you asking some questions. So maybe to find some answers, you can pull up the communityairmobility.org, look at our UAM 101 video presentations, read some of our what we call Cami notes, which are our resource documents that are all 5 pages or less that talk about specific issues. And then if you are a transportation decision maker or a city planner that's interested in doing more of a deep dive into this area, we are launching a new cohort of our Urban Air Policy Collaborative, which is an opportunity to have some deep dive conversations and some workshops in a small cohort environment with other sort of like-minded forward-leaning jurisdictions as we talk about the issues around urban air mobility and help people familiarize themselves with what this is and where it's going. So that next cohort is forming now. It'll be forming through the end of this year. And we'd love to have your interest if you are someone in that space. And there's a lot of people in that space. So we're talking to all of you. We're talking to the elected officials, the urban planners, maybe not for maybe the general public, not so much for the cohorts, but certainly for the conversation at large. Airports, we really want to be making sure that everybody that needs to be at the table for this conversation is there, and to help facilitate that dialogue. So in the spirit of dialogue, please do feel free to reach out, contact@communityairmobility.org. That'll get forwarded to my inbox, as well as a couple other folks on our team. And we really would be happy to continue to have this conversation. Appreciate your attention and the time.